Welcome to Fireside History for Sleep. I'm Lawrance Pembroke, and tonight we're stepping into the strange and unsettling world of medieval justice, exploring the most bizarre punishments ever dreamed up in Europe. From barrels and bridles to collars of iron, these were sentences designed as much for spectacle as for suffering. If you enjoy drifting into history with me, don't forget to like and subscribe. It truly helps keep the stories flowing. Imagine walking through a crowded medieval market, but every eye is fixed on you because you're trapped inside a giant wooden barrel, your head and arms poking through holes. This wasn't a carnival stunt. It was the drunkard's cloak, a punishment designed to humiliate you into sobriety. Why did towns choose theatrical shame over physical harm? And how did these strange devices keep order in communities where everyone knew everyone else? Tonight, we'll explore the bizarre machinery of justice that turned punishment into unforgettable public theater. Picture stumbling through narrow cobbled streets, your body swallowed whole by a heavy wooden cask. The rim chafes against your shoulders, the interior dark and suffocating, and every step feels unsteady. You can't lift your arms without hitting the barrel's edges, can't move fast enough to disappear. From every doorway and market stall, faces turn toward you, some sneering, some laughing outright as you shuffle forward, a human barrel on public display. Above the muffled sound of your own footsteps, there's the constant murmur of comments, pointed fingers tracking your progress. You smell the scent of spilled ale still soaked into the wood, as if the punishment itself has a voice reminding you why you're here. This was the drunkard's cloak, a punishment reserved for those who had taken their drinking too far in public. On the surface, it seems strange to respond to disorderly drunkenness with a wooden trap paraded through the town. But that was the point. This was less about inflicting lasting physical injury and more about turning you into an unmistakable example. The weight of the cask and the slow, awkward pace it forced were features rather than flaws. You could neither hide nor hurry past the judgment of your neighbors. The procession was the punishment. For medieval authorities, this was a practical choice. Drunkards could be beaten, imprisoned, or fined, but those methods carried risks and costs. Death in a cell, an injury that could spark community outrage, or a payment the guilty person couldn't afford. A public shaming avoided these complications. It delivered a spectacle that satisfied the community's sense of order without spilling blood. In some places, the cask made the offender so unwieldy that even the temptation to lash out at onlookers was removed. Survival was almost guaranteed. The real wound was to pride. Records indicate that the practice appeared in different forms across parts of Germany, with some evidence pointing to use in other regions influenced by similar laws. The method was flexible. Sometimes the cask was an actual beer barrel with holes cut for the head and arms. In other places, it was a wooden frame built to resemble one, lighter but equally humiliating. Town squares were the favored setting, though offenders might be marched through the length of the town to ensure every possible witness had the opportunity to see what happened when drink overstepped the limits of local tolerance. When you think about it in modern terms, there's an echo of the so-called walk of shame, though here it lasted far longer and involved an audience eager to participate. The knowledge that every neighbor, rival, or customer would see you reduced to a sight of mockery was enough to keep many from risking the experience. Social standing was fragile, and these communities relied heavily on reputation. Once tarnished, it could be difficult or impossible to repair. The cloak turned intoxication from a private lapse into a permanent story everyone could tell about you afterward. The design carried a deeper layer of meaning, too. Beer and ale were common parts of daily life in much of Europe, safer in many cases to drink than the water. Overindulgence, though, was seen as a moral failing. By placing a drunkard inside a barrel, the authorities made a literal connection between the crime and its vessel. You became physically the thing you misused. The object that held your vice now held you, transforming symbol into sentence. It's a simple image, but a potent one. Easy for a child to understand and impossible for an adult to forget. Magistrates and constables would often choose the busiest hours for these processions. Midday, when the markets were loud with trade, was perfect. Fishmongers hawked their catch. Livestock bleated in pens, and the clink of merchants' coins created a constant rhythm. Into this noise came the slow scrape of wooden cask on clothing, the muffled shuffle of stumbling feet. Some spectators would jeer, calling out insults that drew more attention. Others might whisper and gesture while keeping their distance. Few resisted at least a sideways glance. The humiliation was magnified by the ordinariness of everything else happening. The punishment was not a staged event in a secluded square, but woven directly into the pattern of daily life. The length of the display could vary. In some towns, an hour might suffice. In others, offenders trudged through the streets for the better part of a day, returning home with aching shoulders and an overwhelming desire never to repeat the experience. The barrel, once removed, might still feel present, like phantom weight pressing down. In tight-knit towns, it was not only the day of punishment that mattered, but the days after, when nods and smirks from others reminded you that they remembered. Interestingly, the cloak sometimes extended beyond just the guilty individual. In cases where drunkenness led to public brawls or disorderly groups, several people could be made to wear smaller casks or be tied together in them, amplifying their collective humiliation. The spectacle became a cautionary scene for young men prone to drink too much ale during festivals or on market day. In this way, justice relied heavily on theatre. The story being told was not hidden behind court walls. It was acted out in daylight for all to witness. Every person on the street became part of the stage, whether as the jeering audience or the silent observer. And unlike punishments that left only the offender and their family aware of the sentence, this one ensured a community-wide memory. Such memories could shape behavior for years, especially when those who had endured the cloak became walking warnings. The drunkard's cloak served as an early form of behavioral conditioning through shared experience. To see the town baker one day bent under a cask might make a customer think twice before overindulging at the next feast. The goal was deterrence through visible consequence, not rehabilitation in the way we might think of it today. The pain was of the mind and spirit, inflicted by the very people whose acceptance you needed to live comfortably. Not all offenders reformed, of course, but enough did, or at least enough were discouraged, that the method persisted in some places for generations. It reinforced authority without expensive enforcement measures, and crucially, it gave the appearance of community involvement in the justice system. Citizens didn't need to trust unseen judges. They saw with their own eyes what happened to rule breakers, and they themselves took part, through their presence, in carrying out the sentence. It's worth noticing how this approach blurs the line between justice and performance. On the day of your punishment, your personal humiliation transformed into public entertainment. For some observers, laughter outweighed moral lesson. But for the system, it didn't matter. Both reactions fulfilled the same purpose. They marked you and they warned others. And this wasn't the only time punishment in medieval Europe made use of spectacle over sheer pain. The cloak may have been heavy, but it left your body mostly intact. Other methods focused on controlling something far more difficult to restrain: your words. Some punishments reached past the body's freedom to move and aimed straight at the ability to speak, to voice thoughts, or even to argue back. And those who found themselves in that position often discovered that loss of voice could wound more deeply than the bite of a wooden cask. Imagine being strapped into a solid wooden chair, your arms held tight against the worn planks, the iron bands biting into your sleeves. You're balanced over the edge of a murky pond or the dark stretch of a riverbank. Your neighbors are gathered close enough for you to see the expressions on their faces, some fixed in delight, others sharp with judgment. The water below gives off a sour smell, a mix of silt, weeds, and whatever else has been emptied into it. Then the mechanism creaks and cold, filthy water swallows you whole. This was the cucking stool, a punishment aimed at those labeled as scolds. In many cases, that meant women accused of gossip, quarrels, or being too outspoken in public. The idea was simple but layered in meaning. Take someone whose words had, in the eyes of the community, stirred trouble and subject them to a public humiliation that everyone could witness. The act didn't just quiet a voice for the moment. It sent a message about which voices were allowed to be heard. The name cucking holds its own sting. In medieval English, cuck had a strong association with filth, refuse, and the waste nobody wanted near them. The punishment's very title tied the accused to something unclean before the crowd even arrived to watch. It made the accusation not only about behavior, but about personal worth. To be set on a cucking stool was to be placed in the minds of onlookers among the lowest and most undesirable members of the community. Not every stool looked the same. In some towns, it was a sturdy chair fixed to the bank of a body of water, mounted on a beam so the victim could be swung out over the surface. In other places, the stool was fixed to the end of a long plank balanced on a hinge, allowing the accused to be plunged repeatedly with the movement of a lever. There were also mobile versions, chairs fastened to carts or wheel frames, used for parading the guilty through the streets before or after the dunking. Sometimes this moving stool was all the punishment required, with the jeers of the public replacing the cold slap of river water. The dunking process was as much a performance as it was a sentence. The crowd's anticipation would build as the accused was secured into the chair, sometimes with ropes around the torso and ankles to keep them from struggling free. The operator, be it a constable, appointed watchman, or even hired laborer, would then swing the prisoner out over the water. A pause allowed everyone to take in the scene. Then gravity and leverage took over, tipping the seated figure down into the depths. Water closed over the head, muffling voices and cutting off sight. A second later, the victim re-emerged, dripping and gasping, hair plastered to the face, clothes heavy with river mud and weeds. Laughter often rose at this moment, accompanied by shouts demanding another dunk. In more theatrical sessions, the process was repeated several times, the timing left to the whim of the operator or the crowd's appetite for spectacle. The whole event played out like a play without a script, except everyone knew their role. The accused was the spectacle, the chair was the stage, and the townspeople were both audience and, in a way, the executioners of the sentence. Every cheer, every shout, every pointed finger added weight to the punishment. It was not only about the discomfort of being soaked and shivering in dirty water, it was about the collective force of reputation collapsing around you. What makes the cucking stool stand out is how it targeted speech rather than theft, violence, or neglect. It was used to enforce silence in a way that was gendered and deliberate. Most records show women as its victims, with scold serving as a broad label for anything from slandering a neighbor to speaking too aggressively in public. In a society where men dominated formal roles in governance and trade, such punishments neatly reinforced those divisions. Even without physical harm, the public degradation could break a person's social standing entirely, ensuring they would think twice before speaking out again. Court rolls from several English towns record the formal sentencing of women to the stool for accusations as specific as brawling with her neighbor or uttering slander against the wife of. These entries often lack the detail of the actual event, but the brevity may speak to the routine nature of the punishment. Everyone knew what it involved. The record did not need to describe the jeering crowd or the rush of cold water to the lungs. But we can imagine. Market stalls closing temporarily as people hurried to see what was happening. Children pushing through the edges of the gathering for a better view. Friends of the accused perhaps shouting for leniency, only to be drowned out by louder voices calling for another plunge. Each scene fed into a memory that would be told again and again, the kind of shared story that communities used to set the limits of acceptable behavior. The effectiveness came from this social memory. After the dunking, the soaked victim would still have to walk home under the eyes of the same people who had laughed an hour earlier. The clothes might dry, but the mark on reputation stayed fresh. In small towns, there was no escape from the glances and whispers that followed for weeks or even years. Even the chair itself was a symbol. Sometimes painted or marked to make its purpose obvious, it signaled shame in a way that could be understood at a distance. If it was wheeled through the streets as part of a parade, it transformed the act of moving from one place to another into a slow journey of humiliation. With each turn of the wheels, more witnesses were added, each ready to pass along what they had seen. The cucking stool reveals how punishment could be as much about reinforcing the structure of a community as it was about addressing an offense. By making an example of the scold, The authorities, and by extension the crowd, affirmed a certain order: who could speak, who could not, and what happened to those who crossed that line. The water was incidental. The real depth lay in the act of public degradation. And this was far from the most unusual tool used to silence voices. If the cucking stool was blunt and public, there were other punishments that were more pointed. Devices crafted with a kind of twisted craftsmanship, built not just to humiliate someone for their words, but to physically bind them to a symbol of their supposed offense. Some even borrowed the appearance of instruments meant to bring joy, turning them into something no one would want to play. A man stands in the center of the square, clutching a long, dull metal flute. The midday sun catches on its cold surface, but no music comes from it. His hands are locked in place around the instrument by iron cuffs, wrists forced into a fixed position that keeps him from lowering them. Sweat runs down his face, trailing toward the collar of his tunic. The crowd doesn't look away. A few lean forward as if waiting for him to play, though they know he cannot. Some laugh. Others shake their heads slowly, as if the sight confirms something they already believed about him. This is the shame flute, an object made to look almost like a musician's tool, but built for no purpose except humiliation. It was sometimes placed on those accused of playing music badly in public, but its reach went further, used also against fraud or other disturbances that called for a public marking out of guilt. While the device's name suggests a punishment for poor melody, the broader point was always the same: to transform an object of skill and joy into something that froze its wearer in awkward stillness. There is an uncomfortable irony at the heart of it. Instruments are usually associated with sound, performance, and the craft of bringing people together. The shame flute, however, produced nothing except silence and spectacle. The closer it looked to the real thing, the sharper the intended sting for anyone whose life or trade was tied to making music. Being made to grasp such an object without a note to play turned the act of holding an instrument into a performance of failure. The construction left nothing to chance. It was heavy, more so than it appeared from a distance. The tube was often metal, sometimes wood, clad with metal fixtures and built longer and thicker than a normal flute. The hands were enclosed by attached shackles so that the wearer could not let go even for a moment. These fixed cuffs also dictated posture. You had to stand or walk with the instrument extended in front of you, every step a reminder of your restriction. Shoulders burned, fingers swelled, and the inability to move your hands freely made even small adjustments difficult. Over hours, that weight could feel like a steady pull toward the ground. It was big enough to be obvious at a glance, the kind of item that needed no introduction. People passing through the square didn't have to be told what it meant. In some towns, the shame flute bore simple engravings to mark it as property of the town or a particular guild. In others, its size alone was the message, a grotesque exaggeration of a common object. To the medieval mind, symbolism mattered as much as the act itself. Just as the drunkard's cloak turned a barrel into a wearable warning, the shame flute warped a musician's tool into a prop for disgrace. Music was a valued craft, one that required skill, patience, and practice. To misuse it, whether by playing poorly before an audience or misusing the role of musician to swindle others, was to betray that value. The punishment didn't simply call you a fool, it dressed you in the proof of it. In some cases, the offender stood in place for the duration of their sentence, rooted in the square or at the steps of a guild hall. At other times, watchmen would escort them on a slow march through busy streets. This moving display carried the shame flute past marketplaces, taverns, and churchyards, multiplying the number of witnesses with each stop. The act of walking became deliberate, each turn toward a new street exposing the fixed pose to a fresh group of eyes. The slow progression meant there was no escaping the reactions. Farmers carrying sacks of grain would pause to watch the procession go by. Children would point, imitating the stiff-armed position, while older townsfolk muttered about the crime. Conversations broke off to make space for the sight in the street. Even those who said nothing might glance twice, making sure they recognized the face to connect it later with the story of why this person was carrying such an object in such a way. It was a form of what might be called performative punishment, taking a tool related to the offense and altering it so it no longer functioned as intended. Blacksmiths who cheated customers might be made to wear broken tongs. Bakers accused of selling underweight bread might carry their own loaves strung around their necks. The shame flute fit neatly into this tradition, its false promise of music a pointed reminder of what its owner had allegedly spoiled. The humiliation had layers. For a musician, it was professional ruin to be seen as the target of such a sentence. For anyone else, it was still a highly visible brand of guilt. The object's familiarity worked against the wearer. Everyone knew what it was meant to be, and the silence made the absence of real skill or trustworthiness all the more obvious. There was no performance to redeem yourself, only the long, exhausting role of the blamed. What may have hurt as much as the mockery was the enforced passivity. Holding the shame flute was not a thing you could fight against without drawing more ridicule. Dropping it wasn't possible. Covering your face was impossible with your hands fixed in place. Standing still meant enduring the close stares. Walking meant feeling the weight with every movement. After the hour or day was over, the soreness in wrists and back might fade, but the memory, both yours and the crowd's, would remain. Communities valued this kind of punishment because it required no prison and little expense. Its effect was in the public memory it created. Days later, the image of someone shuffling along with a mock instrument remained fresh enough for retelling, carrying the cautionary tale onward. It replaced the need for written record among those who could not read. The visual itself was the account. In a society where trades and identities were deeply linked, tailoring a punishment to the offender's profession or public role made it feel personal to both the guilty and the witnesses. Strangers might not know every detail of the accusation, but they could read the message from the scene alone. The shame flute told them, here is someone who was trusted with music or public conduct and failed in a way that warrants our notice. Standing in silence, the weight of the instrument pulling your shoulders forward, you would feel the hours stretch out. There was no place for your eyes to rest that did not offer another reminder of your audience. In the careful design of such punishments, stillness could hurt as much as blows. But if the shame flute trapped you in a parody of your craft, other devices went even further, removing the possibility of speech entirely. Where this one froze your hands and mocked your skill, some contraptions would reach into your mouth itself, ensuring that not one word, note, or cry could pass your lips. A cold iron frame closes around your head, its curved bands pressing against your temples and jaw. A narrow plate juts inward, its rough surface resting against your tongue so that even the smallest movement hurts. You try to shift the plate away, but the pressure stays with you, unyielding. Any attempt to speak sends the spike deeper, drawing an instant reminder that silence is the only option left. Air tastes of metal. The weight pulls slightly toward the ground, making your neck ache. This is the Brank's bridle, also called the scold's bridle. It was used most often in England and Scotland, and its presence alone was enough to make people lower their voices. The device looked like a shaped cage, formed from flat iron strips that ran over the head and under the chin, connected with pins and locks. The design could vary from town to town, but its effect was always the same. It took away the ability to speak, and it made that loss visible to everyone. The bridle was strapped on as a response to slander, gossip, or any perceived verbal disruption. Those who were labeled as troublemakers in speech, especially women accused of being scolds, were the most common targets. It was not a private sentence carried out in a cell. Once fastened, the wearer was usually paraded along main streets or stationed in a public space. The act of walking with the bridle in place turned the condemned into something akin to a sign carried on two legs, a moving statement of guilt and submission. The physical restrictions were plain. The metal frame limited how much you could open your mouth, and the inserted plate made speech not only impossible but painful to attempt. Even swallowing became awkward. Some bridles had additional hooks that kept the tongue pressed downward. Others were fitted with small bells or horns that rattled with movement, ensuring that people could hear your approach before they saw you. Such additions drew more attention and increased the duration of the humiliation by marking your presence at every step. Walking under this kind of attention meant enduring a community's full scrutiny. Market-goers would pause in their bargaining to turn toward you. Groups of children might follow for part of the way, staring openly. Neighbors who had once spoken quick greetings at your passing might avoid eye contact, as if caught between curiosity and shame on your behalf. Throughout it all, the bridle prevented you from answering back, even if the accusations had been false or the punishment seemed unjust. Records from the period note specific cases in which the bridle was used. In some, the charge was simple, spreading harmful rumors about another resident. In others, it was refusal to retract a public insult. There are accounts of women fitted with the bridle for brawling with words in a churchyard or accusing another of theft without proof. The crimes were not violent, yet the response was immediate and designed to make an impression. The journey from sentencing to punishment could be very short. In smaller towns, a constable might fetch the bridle from a nearby storeroom and fit it to the accused within the hour. The psychological effect was layered. It was not only the inability to speak that weighed on the wearer, but the certainty that everyone could see the restraint. The metal made a stark shape against the face and head, impossible to mistake for anything other than a tool of punishment. In an age when public honor affected survival through trade, alliances, and marriage, to be displayed in the bridle was to serve notice that your word was no longer trusted. Even after it was removed, that label could linger in the minds of witnesses. Some of the surviving bridles reveal details about how deliberate these choices were. There is evidence of decorative etching along the metal, either in patterns or short inscriptions, reinforcing the message of the punishment. A few had exaggerated features, such as extended brow plates or large frontal pieces, that made the device seem heavier and more oppressive. These were not accidents of design. They amplified the degradation by making the restraint appear even more severe than it was. The use of the bridle also underscores the connection between physical control and social order in the period. By locking the mouth closed, the authorities sent a clear signal. Your voice belonged to the community's standards, not to you. It was a visible claim over an individual's most basic means of influence, speech. In a culture where spoken reputation could decide disputes and determine standing, removing that power was a form of disarmament. Imagine the walk itself. You might be led past the home of the person you had supposedly wronged, past the stalls where you once bought bread or cloth, and through the square at its busiest hour. You could not explain, could not object. If someone called out a question, you could only stare back, the spike forcing your tongue to remain still. A slip of the head might set the bells tinkling, drawing fresh glances. Every step told those watching that you had been put in your place. In some towns, the wearer would be tied to a fixed post for a set time before or after being paraded. Here, the public had a chance to examine the bridle closely, to note the way it fit and how it bent the posture forward. This stillness gave greater opportunity for whispers and muttering among onlookers, which could be almost as damaging as outright jeers. The offense itself became less important than the act of being restrained, which stood as proof enough for many of those watching. Over time, the bridle became part of the shared visual memory of a community. People might recall not just the names of those who wore it, but the exact day, the weather, or the noise of the bells. Once such scenes were established in local memory, they served as reminders that words, if used outside accepted boundaries, could bring as swift and public a punishment as theft or physical harm. The power of this device was not in its mechanics, but in its presence. As a cage for the head, it was effective at keeping the mouth closed. As a public marker, it transformed a person into living proof of the consequences of defiance. The wearer's silence did the speaking, reinforcing the idea that some voices could be removed at will. It is easy to see why people feared it. Once fitted, there was no way to regain dignity until the keys turned and the iron lifted away. The Brank's bridle was a sentence carried in full view, and in the medieval mind, that visibility was where its force truly lay. Long after the iron cooled from the heat of the skin and the tongue stopped aching, the fact of having been seen in it could shadow every interaction. It was a warning to all who witnessed it and a final stamp on the reputation of the accused. Yet not all medieval punishments were this static. Some did not stop at restraint or silent parade. There were trials where the body itself became the measure of innocence or guilt, with the outcome left in the open for days. You lower your arm toward the cauldron, steam rising in thick waves that sting the skin before you even touch the water. The surface churns, bubbles breaking one after another. All eyes are on you. You know that in the days ahead, every mark the heat leaves on your skin will decide whether you are guilty or innocent. There is no escape once your hand breaks the surface. The pain comes quickly, and the crowd does not look away. This was the ordeal, a form of trial that joined legal judgment to the idea of divine will. In the minds of those who gathered to watch, your fate depended not on evidence or argument, but on whether God would choose to protect you. If you emerged unscathed or healed faster than nature allowed, you were innocent. If not, the guilt was yours to carry, sometimes to the gallows. This belief was not questioned by most. It rested on a foundation of faith that measured truth by divine sign rather than human reasoning. There were several ways to test that truth. In one, you reached into a cauldron to lift an object from boiling water, the heat burning skin through sheer contact. In another, you carried a bar of red-hot iron across an open space, each step a test of endurance. In the cold water ordeal, you were bound and lowered into a lake or river. Here, survival itself might not be enough. Floating marked you as guilty, for the water was said to reject those who lied before God. Sinking was a sign of innocence, though it carried its own risks. Either way, the outcome was held to be beyond human control. The setting gave these acts the feel of a public ritual. Townspeople gathered in open squares or near churchyards where the ordeal was staged. Priests might be present to bless the water or the iron, calling on God to reveal the truth. Bystanders pressed closer, straining to see not just the act, but how the accused faced it. Every wince, every sharp breath recorded in their memory. It was as much a communal moment as it was a judgment, with the crowd taking part in what they believed was a sacred unveiling. The trial did not end the moment the test was done. In most cases, the proof came later. After the boiling water or hot iron ordeal, the wounds were bound in cloth, and the accused went home under the watch of local officials or witnesses. Days later, 3 was common. The bandages were removed for inspection. If the burns had healed cleanly, with no sign of infection, it was taken as the hand of God clearing the accused. If the skin had worsened or failed to mend, the verdict turned to guilt. Those days in between filled the air with tension. People speculated openly at markets and in taverns about what would be found when the wrappings came off. This delay also allowed space for influence. The officials who declared someone healed or corrupted were often the same who had ordered the ordeal in the first place. In theory, this handover was impartial. In practice, the result could align neatly with the wishes of local leaders or the pressures of political convenience. An accused person with powerful enemies might find their burns declared unfit for release. Someone whose punishment would disrupt community life, on the other hand, might be miraculously cleared. Even with this manipulation, the appearance of divine judgment was critical. The ordeal was not framed as a test made by men, but as an act put before God. This framing protected the system from challenge. After all, to question the verdict was to question the will of the divine. For the crowd, the outcome confirmed their faith and strengthened the authority of those who led the proceedings. It was an arrangement where power was maintained under the guise of sacred truth. There are accounts of ordeals where the ending favored the accused in striking ways. One record tells of a man charged with theft who was ordered to hold a red-hot iron for several paces. Witnesses claimed his hand bore no mark the next day, and he was set free. Whether this was seen as a miracle or the iron cooled more than it should have is not recorded, but in the town's telling, it stood as proof that the guilty cannot hide from God, and the innocent will be spared. Such stories added to the ordeal's place in communal life, retold until they became part of a shared history. The crimes that led to these trials could be grave: theft, suspected witchcraft, heresy. These were not matters taken lightly. In such cases, the ordeal was as much a performance of moral order as a search for truth. It had weight, both real and symbolic. Seeing a heretic face, the boiling water was meant to remind all present of the dangers of straying from the accepted path. Watching a thief carry the red-hot iron signaled that dishonesty would be answered with fire. Every choice of test carried its own layer of meaning. In this, the ordeal sat at the meeting point of law, religion, and spectacle. It was an event that demanded witnesses, for without them, its lessons would fade. People repeated what they had seen, the way the water hissed when hands entered, the smell of scorched skin, the bandages being wrapped tight. They spoke of the prayers before the act and the moment the accused faced the test. This retelling carried the verdict far beyond the square, into outlying farms and neighboring villages, so that even those absent took in the warning. The suspense did not end with the verdict itself. The delay between test and declaration meant that entire communities were left waiting, making the eventual announcement all the more decisive. Relief or outrage followed, depending on where sympathies lay. The result could alter alliances, disrupt trades, or affirm long-running suspicions. The visible sign of the ordeal, a bandaged arm or a lingering limp, lingered as a reminder. Yet beneath the surface of faith lay the quieter reality that belief was as important as any physical mark. If the crowd accepted the result, it became true in a lasting way, regardless of how the wounds had been judged. In this sense, the ordeal did more than decide cases. It reinforced the idea that justice was what the community could see, agree upon, and pass on. The truth became a shared construction, clothed in the language of divine will. For the medieval world, this merging of ceremony and sentence made the ordeal a powerful tool. It served those in authority by giving their decisions the weight of heaven, and it satisfied the public desire for justice that could be seen and remembered. Every trial performed in this way affirmed not just the guilt or innocence of the accused, but the unity of the onlookers in a system they believed, at least outwardly, was guided by God. But not all punishments sought the hand of divine decision. Some were designed to work on the body alone, crafted with an ingenuity aimed at drawing out pain in ways the crowd could witness without the theater of prayer or prophecy. In the middle of the square, a strange figure draws the eye. They sit astride a long wooden beam raised off the ground, their legs hanging on either side. At first, the sight might seem almost like a child's toy, the donkey shape sometimes dressed with a carved head and tail. But nothing about the posture suggests play. Their face is tense, hands gripping the beam for balance. The sharp, narrow edge of the seat allows no comfort, hacking away at muscle and nerve as minutes turn to hours. Beneath them, weights dangle from their ankles, dragging down with a steady pull that shifts all the pressure onto the unforgiving edge. The wooden donkey was one of those punishments that use simplicity to achieve lasting effect. At its heart, it was nothing more than a beam with a ridge sharp enough to focus all the body's weight into a single thin line. Offenders were made to straddle it, their legs unable to rest. The pointed top meant that even standing to stretch brought no relief. The design forced continued contact with the edge. The addition of iron or stone weights to the feet made the whole arrangement worse, pressing the body down into the sharp line until every small movement hurt. It demanded very little to build, but it extracted a lot from the one forced to endure it. The choice of setting was deliberate. These rides rarely took place out of sight. They were almost always staged in central, open places, the crossroads, the market square, or the yard outside the local barracks. Everyone passing through could see the punishment in progress. There was no way to pass in or out of the square without having the image fixed in memory. Someone perched awkwardly, clothes twisted, face locked in pain. The lack of any guard to block the view was intentional. The public needed to be part of this process. Humiliation came from more than discomfort. Those watching could stand within arm's length, speaking freely to or about the offender, sometimes goading them with insults or questions they couldn't escape. The wooden donkey wasn't fast, like a dunk in water. It kept its target in place for as long as the sentence demanded, which invited the crowd to take their time in reacting. Those sentenced often had to sit through whispered conversations nearby, knowing they were the subject, with no chance to move beyond earshot. The square became a space where the community enacted the punishment alongside the wood and weights. The crimes that earned a place on the donkey varied, but they often carried associations with moral or disciplinary failure. In towns, it could be indecent conduct. flagrant acts in public, behavior deemed lewd, or actions that crossed unspoken lines of propriety. In military settings, soldiers were common riders. A lapse of discipline, drunkenness on duty, or fighting among ranks might result in an offender being led to the donkey in front of their peers. Here, the threat of disgrace was as sharp as the beam. Fellow soldiers watching were meant to remember the posture and think twice before risking the same seat. The length of the ordeal was not fixed across Europe. Some endured an hour. Others were left until nightfall. Severity could be measured in time or in how much weight was added. For long punishments, the combination of steady pain on the inner thighs and pressure on the spine could make standing afterward nearly impossible. The line between temporary punishment and lasting injury was thin, and the people in charge of the sentence knew it. Survival was expected, but comfort was ruled out entirely. Moving the seat indoors during rain or easing the weights early only happened if the one watching the clock decided the lesson had been learned. Craftsmanship in these devices varied. Some were little more than a beam set between two supports, plain and unmarked. Others were painted in bold colors, reds and blues that made them noticeable from a distance. Some bore carved details, the head of an animal at one end, a tail at the other, mocking the act as a kind of twisted performance. Those decorative touches didn't make the pain worse physically, but they amplified the shame by turning the punishment into a spectacle that people might talk about long after it ended. I saw the carpenter sitting the donkey with the red head was easier to remember and pass on than a plain, unnoted seat. Placing the donkey higher off the ground also forced the rider into greater instability, balancing precariously while resisting the downward drag of the weights. Feet dangling above the square could not rest on anything solid, and the inability to shift position meant pressure could not be eased. Any attempt to adjust one's seat risked losing balance and drawing laughs from the crowd. Even without taunts, the physical strain told its own story. Sweat along the forehead, small shivers creeping into the legs, the gradual slump forward as muscles gave way. The punishment worked on two levels at once. First, it created steady, accumulating pain through the seat and weights. Second, it displayed that suffering to the public. A rider bent over in visible discomfort became a warning in flesh and posture. Those who had once been equals in the street or market were now reduced to a figure everyone else would point to for years. In more tightly knit communities, where most people knew each other's names, this kind of public ruin was more than temporary embarrassment. It could affect someone's trade, marriage prospects, and standing among neighbors. Despite its simplicity, the wooden donkey had range. Military camps could set one up with spare materials and put it into use the same day. Town councils could have a permanent one in the square, making the threat constant and visible even when unoccupied. Its existence served as a hanging reminder that offense and spectacle were closely bound. You didn't just pay for the crime in private, you became part of the day's events for everyone else. It's telling that in some places the seat was kept in full sight when not in use. People crossing the square might glance at it and picture someone on it, as they perhaps had seen last month or the year before. The memory was enough to keep certain behaviors in check. The knowledge that your punishment would be both slow and made into entertainment had a weight all its own, just as real as the stones tied to a rider's feet. Some versions of the donkey even added sound to the ordeal. Loose fittings in the supports or carved ridges could creak or scrape with every small movement. While not painful in themselves, these noises drew glances from those nearby, reminding the rider with each shift that attention never fully left them. When the offender was finally released, they usually stepped awkwardly onto the ground, legs numb, back stiff, moving through the same space, now free but surrounded by those who had seen them reduced. The ride left no broken bones by design, but it could leave a limp for days or bruises that took weeks to fade. And long after skin healed, the public memory would still serve as a mark of what had happened. In this way, the wooden donkey merged the direct sting of physical punishment with the slower burn of public shame. Neither on its own would have been as effective. Together, they made a device that could scar a reputation as surely as it strained the body. It stood as a reminder in wood and paint that dishonor was not something you carried in private. It was to be sat upon, seen, and remembered by everyone who walked the square. But not every sentence ended when the crowd drifted away. Some punishments were made to cling to the offender past the market, past the day, following them into every street and doorway for weeks after the official moment had ended. Day after day, you carry it. A solid band of metal locked tight around your neck. It moves with you when you walk, tugs when you turn your head. The skin beneath is rubbed raw where the edge rests, a ring of pressure you can't escape. Anyone passing by can read the words cut into its surface, letters rough but clear enough to leave no doubt about what you have done. They don't need to ask your name. They already know your story because it's written there for everyone to see. The iron collar was a sentence you wore. Heavy enough to feel with every movement, it marked its wearer as someone set apart from ordinary life. There was no private term to be served behind closed doors. This punishment followed you into the streets, the marketplace, the church. It was not tied to a single moment of shaming like a parade or a day in the stocks. The collar could stay in place for days, weeks, or longer, making the humiliation part of your daily existence. Its construction was simple, a thick metal ring shaped to fit closely around the neck, sometimes layered with extra fittings to prevent it from being pried open without tools. The lock might be a simple hasp or a more intricate clasp fixed in place by a pin. In many examples, the surface bore an inscription that spelled out the wearer's offense: thief, liar, fraud, gossip. There was no ambiguity. The letters were large enough for anyone to read at a glance. The judgment needed no witness because all who saw you became witnesses themselves. The effect was instant and unavoidable. In a small town or tight-knit quarter of a city, word of your punishment would travel faster than you could. If you entered a shop, those inside might stare at the inscription before deciding whether to serve you. On the road, a stranger seeing the collar could sidestep and give you space or cross to the other side entirely. With each interaction, the label around your neck did the speaking for you. For some sentences, the collar was chained to a fixed point. The ring still carried the inscription, but now you stood or sat in one place. The outside wall of a church, the gate of the town, the wall of a courthouse. There, the steady traffic of people coming and going would pass by you, leaving glances, comments, even spitting in your direction. Others were left unchained, forced to go about their business with the collar as a constant companion, a portable notice board of your crime. The crimes connected to the iron collar tended to be those seen as disruptive to the community's trust. Petty theft, deceit in trading, false accusations, acts considered corrosive to the bonds of everyday life rather than outright dangerous to it. Lawmakers seemed to understand that the collar worked best for misdeeds where public opinion mattered. A murderer might be executed, but a swindler could live long enough to feel the steady pressure of judgment every time they were seen in the street. Living with the collar meant adapting all your movements. Sleeping required finding a position where the metal didn't bite into your skin. Bending low could force the edge against your throat. Long walks left your shoulders and upper back aching. In winter, the iron chilled enough to sting against bare flesh. In summer, it heated under the sun until it burned. Eating in public meant lifting food carefully over the ring or bending toward the table, all while those nearby read your crime in silence. Some records speak of sentences where the collar stayed in place for a month, the offender bound to a post for certain hours each day and released to move about at others. It could be a cycle of stillness and walking exposure, morning at the gate, afternoon at market, evening to return home. In these accounts, it's easy to see the collar not just as an object, but as a timetable of shame dictated by the court's decision. The permanence of the inscription left no space for denial. Even years later, people might remember the exact lettering they once saw encircling your throat. And in a period where personal dealings were built on reputation, that memory could close doors long after the sentence ended. Anyone recalling the sight could pass on the story to others, renewing its reach. In this way, the collar ensured that the punishment outlasted the actual wearing of it. There's an echo of this in how we think about records today. An arrest, a conviction, even an accusation, once publicized, can shadow someone for years in the digital world. The collar was an earlier physical version of this, where the record accompanied you in person, unavoidable and unalterable. There was no chance to control how people interpreted it, no way to step into a space without carrying the mark. In some towns, the collar itself became a kind of civic property. It might hang unused on a wall until needed, a reminder to all who saw it of the possibility of ending up wearing it. In others, a set of collars existed for different crimes, each with its own wording, so the nature of the offense could be known without question. To see a man tethered under the word thief was to see the community's verdict embodied. It wasn't just known, it was displayed in metal day after day. The restriction was more than symbolic. A collar heavy enough could limit your ability to turn quickly, to carry goods on your shoulders, or to work in certain roles without constant strain. The act of wearing it could change how you moved through spaces, forcing you to navigate doorways and crowds differently. Its physicality made the shame tangible. It wasn't a sentence you could put aside at will. The iron collar made use of time as a punishment. Every hour wearing it reinforced the reminder, both to you and to the people who saw you. Even moments alone would carry the weight, literally, of what the community thought of you. It blurred the divide between a formal sentence and the rest of your life, because in the hours you slept, the collar still pressed down, and in the hours you worked, it still drew stares. In a way, its power lay in endurance rather than spectacle. A parade or a day in the stocks could fade quickly in memory, but a collar you wore for weeks became part of the landscape. People would get used to seeing you with it, which meant they would get used to thinking of you in its terms. The punishment was carried not just on your body, but in the minds of those around you, and that was harder to remove than the lock. In the end, the iron collar worked by making a person into their own punishment. No stage, no special event, just the steady exposure of walking through daily life with a declaration of guilt circling your neck. It turned visibility itself into a weapon, and the memory it left behind ensured that the mark it made would outlast the metal. Seen this way, these objects reflect less on the crimes than on the communities that used them. The choice to make a sentence portable, constant and public speaks to what mattered most. Not just that justice be done, but that it be seen. Medieval punishments were less about cruelty for its own sake than about staging a performance everyone could witness. These acts turned justice into a shared event where humiliation carried more weight than the instruments themselves. In this theater of suffering, we are all both actors and audience, forever bound by the shared performance of our communal values. It's worth asking how much has truly changed. Public shame may now move through screens instead of market squares, but the appetite for watching judgment unfold remains. Consider where we see it today, and whether the need for spectacle still shapes how we decide guilt.